The charge was already ticking when Mira Calloway found it. A fist-sized lump of gray putty wedged behind the coolant manifold of berth 9, and she had exactly enough time to shout before a hand closed on her collar and hauled her backward through the hatch. "Down," Rourke said, and put himself between her and the manifold as if the order and the positioning were the same motion. He did not run. He crossed the 11 meters to the charge at an unhurried walk that made no sense against the red numbers ticking down on its detonator face, knelt, turned it over once in blunt fingers, and pulled a thin wire free with the same care a man might use untangling a fishing line. The countdown froze at 4 seconds. He set the device on the deck plate like it was nothing more than a dead fish, stood, and looked back at her. "Ythir demolition charge," he said. "Old pattern. Somebody wanted it found not to go off." Myra's heart was still slamming against her ribs. Found by who? By whoever's going to walk in behind the dockmaster in about 90 seconds and ask why Calloway Exchange can't even keep its own berth from getting bombed. Rourke picked the charge up, wrapped it in a rag, and dropped it in his coat pocket like spare change. "Smile when they get here. Don't let them see you shake." She hated that he was right about both things, and hated more that 90 seconds later, to the second, Dockmaster Ussa arrived with 2 Vondrek house guards trailing him, and a look on his mandibled face that had already decided what it would find. 6 days. That was what the notice pinned to the tribunal board said, in Concord script and standard both, when Mira read it an hour later with her hand still not quite steady. Berth 9 cradle, holder of record Joss Calloway, missing 11 weeks past the search cutoff on the Oshbelt supply run. Abandonment review opens in 6 days before Magistrate Overseer Sale Rennick. Petitioner, House Vondrek. "They try to blow up my own berth to prove I can't hold it," she said, staring at the notice. "They didn't try very hard," Rourke said behind her. "It wasn't meant to kill anybody. It was meant to be found 10 minutes before Ussa did his rounds, so it'd be in his report before the hearing." He said it the way another man might comment on the weather, and that was somehow worse than if he'd been angry. Mira was 17 years old and she had run Calloway Exchange alone for 11 weeks, and in that time she had learned that the whole of Kessarine Reach's dockside society could be divided cleanly into 2 groups, people who pitied her, and people who wanted what was left of her father's business badly enough to make the pity a formality. She had also learned, faster than she wanted to, that the second group did not knock. She had hired Rourke off the low registry 3 weeks ago because the low registry was the only one that would still extend her credit. He'd cost less than a case of recycled water filters. He was somewhere past 40, gray at the temples, quiet in a way that dockside men who talked themselves up were not, and the first time Keys Vondrek saw him standing post at the exchange gate, the young heir had laughed out loud in the middle of the concourse. "That's her guard," Keys had said to his retinue, loud enough to carry, tendrils along his jaw flaring pale amusement yellow. The little human bought herself a scarecrow. Rourke hadn't moved. He hadn't so much as turned his head. Mira, watching from the exchange doorway, had wanted to die of the humiliation of it, and had hated herself for wanting that more than she hated Keys Vondrek, which told her something about herself she didn't like. The produce factor sin where came by within the hour, before she'd even had time to wash the dust of the coolant manifold off her hands, and stood in the doorway turning his cap in both fists the way men did when they'd rehearsed an apology on the walk over. "I've got to pull the standing order, Miss Calloway," he said. "Nothing personal in it. Man's got to feed his own family before he feeds a house that might not hold its berth past the week." He didn't quite meet her eyes when he said it, and Mira understood, watching him go, that the bomb had done exactly what it was meant to do whether or not it had ever been meant to detonate. It had put a story into the concourse air, and the story was spreading faster than any denial she could offer it. Kessarine found her an hour after that, in the narrow gap between 2 cargo stacks where Mira had gone to be alone for the length of one held breath before the next crisis found her. Kessarine was matron of the third house on the Reach, old enough that her chitin had begun to silver at the leg joints, and she had never in 3 weeks so much as nodded to Mira in passing. "I'm not here on my house's business," Kessarine said, low, glancing once down the row before she spoke further. "House Kessarine does not involve itself in Vondrek's disputes. We learned better." Her throat sack dimmed to a careful, guarded gray. 12 years ago it was the Aldrin concern. 9 years ago the Palwith freight line. Both of them small houses, both of them holding something Vondrek wanted, both of them gone from this station's registry within a season of the trouble starting. It always starts the same way. A small accident nobody can quite trace. A claim filed on a technicality. A house too tired and too alone to keep fighting past the point where fighting stops being worth the cost. She looked at Mira for a long moment. "You are the first to still be standing after the accident stage. I wanted you to know that is already unusual. I cannot say more than that, and I will deny saying even this much if you repeat it. But watch the sky for others, Miss Calloway. Vondrek is rarely a single storm." She was gone before Mira could ask what she meant by others, and Mira stood alone in the gap between the cargo stacks, turning the warning over, understanding for the first time that whatever was closing around Calloway Exchange had closed around other houses before it, and that every one of them had lost. With a diffused bomb in her guard's coat pocket, a cancelled produce order, and a stranger's warning she wasn't yet sure how to use, Mira didn't have room left for humiliation. She had room for exactly one thing, which was getting through the next 6 days with the exchange, and the berth, and whatever was left of her father's name, still in her hands. "Tell me the actual odds," she said to Rourke, because he was the only person on the Reach who still spoke to her like an adult who could survive hearing them. Not the kind version. "Abandonment review needs 3 things to go Vondrek's way," Rourke said. "Proof your father's presumed dead under conquered definitions. They have that. The search board closed it. Proof you can't hold the berth without him. They're building that, starting with a bomb they can blame on your incompetence. And proof there's a better claimant standing by." He looked toward the concourse, where House Vondrek's black and copper banners hung outside a warehouse 3 times the size of hers. "They've had that part ready for a year. So I lose." "So you've got 6 days to make the second part false," Rourke said. "That's the only leg they're not sure of yet. That's the one we work." She looked at him properly then, the way she hadn't let herself in 3 weeks of being too proud and too tired to look closely at the man she was paying almost nothing. There was a scar along his jaw that didn't match any dockside brawl, old and clean and surgical in its precision, the kind of mark a blade left when the man wielding it knew exactly where to cut, and the man receiving it knew exactly how to turn his head so it didn't kill him. There was a way he stood in doorways, angled, never square to the opening. She filed it away and said nothing, because the last thing Calloway Exchange needed was one more thing to worry about, and a guard with a past was a luxury problem compared to a guard who was actually a scarecrow. "We work it then," she said, and went to find her father's ledgers. Old Tam found her there 2 hours later, buried in 6 years of cargo manifests spread across the counting room table, ink-stained fingers, and a headache building behind her eyes. He was 61, had known her father since before she was born, and was the only staff member who hadn't quit in the 11 weeks since the Meridian Drift failed to report in from the belt. "You should eat something," he said, setting down a bowl of the station-grown protein mash that was all the exchange's frozen credit line could afford anymore. "I should find out why House Vondrek is so certain they'll win a claim they haven't even proven yet." Mira didn't look up. "Tam, did my father ever mention trouble with the Ocean Vein rights? Anything about the survey record being disputed?" "Disputed how?" "I don't know, that's the problem." She flipped another manifest page. "Vondrek's petition says the vein assay Dad filed 9 years ago overstates our claim boundary by 1/2 kilometer. If that's true, We're squatting on conquered land and Rennick doesn't even need the abandonment clause. She can void the berth outright. Tam's mandibled no. Tam's face, human, weathered, went the particular still that meant he was choosing his words. Your father surveyed that vein himself. Walked every meter of the boundary with a conquered notary standing next to him, so there'd never be a question. Then why does Vondrek think they can prove otherwise? Neither of them had an answer, and that, Mira thought, was the actual shape of the 6 days ahead of her. Not one clean fight, but a dozen small ones, each of them designed to look like an accident, an oversight, a girl too young and too alone to hold what her father had built. She went back to the ledgers. Somewhere past midnight, Rourke came through on his rounds, saw the lamp still burning and didn't tell her to sleep. He only refilled the lamp oil without being asked and went back out into the dark, and Mira decided, with the particular clarity of true exhaustion, that whatever he had once been, he was at least someone who understood that some fights didn't stop for sleep. The concourse market ran loud and bright through the Reach's third shift, stalls lit gold against the dark of the outer hull windows, and it was there, 2 days later, that Kees Vondrek chose to make his second move. He did it in public, at the Fountain Junction where 6 concourses met, with an audience of merchants and dockworkers who would carry the story to every corner of the Reach by morning. Mira had come for filter cartridges. She left with an ultimatum. House Vondrek is prepared to be generous, Kees said, tendrils along his jaw flaring the pale gold of performed reasonableness. His 4 attendants arranged behind him in a fan that made the whole tableau look staged because it was. A settlement, full market value for the berth, paid before the tribunal even convenes. You keep your dignity. You keep enough credit to buy passage anywhere in the Concord you like. He paused, let his gaze travel once, deliberately, to Rourke, standing a pace behind Mira's shoulder. You could even keep your scarecrow if it comforts you. The berth isn't for sale, Mira said. The berth is going to be reassigned in 4 days whether you sell it or not. Kees's voice didn't rise. Ythir rarely raised their voices. Anger showed in the throat sac color, and his had gone a hard, saturated amber that Mira was learning to read as contempt held just barely in check. I am offering you a way to lose with something in your hands instead of nothing. Then I'll take nothing, Mira said, and see you at the hearing. It should have ended there. It would have, except that one of Kees's attendants, young, new-molted, the pale soft plates along his abdomen not yet hardened, laughed, a short, ugly bark, and said something in the clicking under register the Ythir used among themselves that wasn't meant for human translation collars, and Mira's collar caught only fragments. Dead father, gutter guard, 6 days until the girl learns what her house was actually worth. Rourke moved. He didn't strike anyone. That was the detail Mira would replay later, turning it over. He crossed the distance to the young attendant in 3 unhurried steps, close enough that the boy, because he was a boy, whatever his true age in Ythir years, young enough that his plates hadn't set, flinched back a full pace on instinct before Rourke had even raised a hand. Rourke said something too low for the crowd to catch, 2 sentences at most, and stepped back to his position at Mira's shoulder as if nothing had happened. The young attendant did not laugh again. His throat sac had gone the mottled gray-white of raw fear, and it did not recover its color for the rest of the encounter. What did you say to him? Mira asked, once they were 3 concourses away and the market noise had swallowed the scene behind them. I told him the difference between what happens to a boy who insults a dead man's daughter in a public market and what happens to a boy who insults a dead man's daughter somewhere private, Rourke said. I let him fill in which one he'd rather have. That's a threat. It's a fact stated politely. He didn't look at her. Vondrek's counting on you being alone enough that a little cruelty goes uncontested. Every time it goes contested, the story that reaches the tribunal changes a little. That matters more than it looks like it does. Mira wanted to ask him where a bargain-rate dockside guard had learned to read a courtroom's temperature 3 moves ahead, and didn't, because some part of her, the part that had spent 3 weeks not looking too closely at the scar on his jaw, was afraid of the answer costing her the only thing on Kessarine Reach that currently stood between her and losing everything. She did not have the luxury of that fear for long. The next morning, old Tam did not report for the dawn cargo count. They found him in the loading corridor behind berth 9, folded against the bulkhead where he dragged himself after 3 men in unmarked coveralls had put a boot into his ribs hard enough to crack 2 of them and taken nothing, because taking nothing was the point. The point was that Calloway exchanges only remaining staff member besides a 17-year-old girl, and a bargain guard could be beaten unconscious in a supposedly secured corridor, and no one would ever prove whose men had done it. "He'll live," the station medic said, an hour later, in the clipped tone of someone who had patched worse and would patch worse again before the shift ended. "Cracked ribs, a concussion. Keep him still." Mira sat by the cot in the tiny infirmary bay and held Tam's hand while he drifted in and out, and did not let herself cry, because crying was a thing she could do later, alone, and right now the only thing that mattered was the fury building clean and cold behind her sternum, a feeling she recognized from her father. She'd seen it in him exactly twice, and both times something had changed because of it. "This isn't a business dispute anymore," she said to Rourke, out in the corridor, once the medic had gone. "This is Vondrek deciding he can hurt anyone connected to me and nothing happens." "That's exactly what it is," Rourke said, "and it's a mistake. Beating an old man in a corridor is the kind of thing that's supposed to stay invisible." "It won't this time." "Why not?" "Because I'm going to make sure it doesn't." He said it without heat, a simple statement of intent, and something in the flatness of it made Mira believe him completely, in a way she hadn't quite let herself believe anything since the search board closed her father's file. The retired dockmaster Gurn ran a repair stall 3 levels down from the exchange, close enough to the labor exchange that he saw every hire come through the low registry. And it was there, that same evening, that Mira went looking for anyone who might have seen who'd hired the men who hurt Tam. She found Gurn instead watching Rourke from behind a stack of pressure gauges, with an expression she couldn't read on an Ythir face but recognized instantly as unease. "You know him," Gurn said when she asked what he was staring at. His voice vibration carried old age in it, a rasp beneath the translation. "Your guard." "I hired him 3 weeks ago." "I did not ask when you hired him." Gurn's throat sac flickered, an unreadable color caught between 2 states. "I asked if you know him. There is a difference, small human, that may matter to you before this is finished." "Then tell me." The old Ythir was quiet a long moment, mandibles working, and then he said only, "Ferrous," and would not say more no matter how she pressed, only repeated the word once like it explained everything, and hobbled back into his stall and shut the grate, leaving Mira standing in the corridor with a word that meant nothing to her and a feeling in her stomach that it should. She did not have time to chase it. The next 2 days brought a poisoned reservoir. Someone had dumped a corrosive agent into the exchange's water allotment, forcing Rourke and Mira to spend a sleepless night flushing lines by hand before the contamination reached the ice processing plant, and gave Vondrek's petition its 3rd leg, incompetence, for free. She brought her father's boundary survey to a Concord notary for independent re-verification, paying for it with credit she didn't have, and got back confirmation that the boundary was exactly where her father had recorded it 9 years ago, which meant Vondrek's claim of a disputed line was fabricated. And fabrication, if she could prove it in front of Rennick, would not just save the berth. It would end House Vondrek's petition in disgrace. If she could prove it. The notary's confirmation was one data point. She needed the original survey filing from the Concord archive itself, cross-referenced against whatever falsified copy Vondrek intended to present, and the archive access she needed required a tribunal clerk's authorization that a house locked in dispute with Vondrek was unlikely to be granted quickly. She went to Magistrate Overseer Sale Rennick's chambers to ask for it anyway, because the alternative was doing nothing, and Mira Calloway had decided, somewhere in the last 11 weeks, that doing nothing was no longer a thing she knew how to do. Rennick's chambers occupied the highest tier of the Reach's administrative spire, a wide half-moon room with a window wall looking out over the docking arms and the slow turn of cargo haulers against the dark. The magistrate overseer was old even by Ythir measure, her chiton gone the deep matte black of advanced age, her throat sack a steady, controlled amber gray that Mira had come to understand meant a mind actively weighing, never resting on one judgment before it had earned it. "You are aware," Rennick said without preamble when Mira had made her request, "that House Vondrek has already filed the counter-survey. Archive access at this stage, absent clerk sign-off, would appear to my bench as evidence shopping. It would not help your case. It might harm it." "My father surveyed that boundary with a conquered notary present," Mira said. "I have independent confirmation the boundary he filed is accurate. If Vondrek's counter-survey shows something different, one of the two documents is false, and it isn't ours." "That is an assertion. I require documents." Rennick's attendant clerk, a younger Ythir with the pale, unmarked plates of a first posting, made a note without being told, and Mira understood she was watching the tribunal's actual machinery for the first time, the part that didn't care about sympathy or spectacle, only paper. "Then give me the time to get you documents. You have 3 days remaining. Then give me 3 days that aren't spent flushing poison out of my water lines, or sitting with an old man whose ribs got broken because I hired the only guard I could afford," Mira said, and heard her own voice crack on the last word, and did not apologize for it, because Rennick was watching her exactly as closely as Mira was watching Rennick. And something told her that the old magistrate respected very little as much as she respected a claimant, who did not pretend to a composure she didn't feel, and did not collapse into one she couldn't sustain either. Rennick's throat sac shifted fractionally toward a color Mira didn't yet have a name for. 3 days, the magistrate overseer said. "Bring me the archive filing yourself, verified, before the hearing opens, and I will weigh it as evidence regardless of how late it arrives. That is the only accommodation my bench can make within the charter. Whether it is enough is not a question I can answer for you." It would have to be enough. Mira left the chambers with the beginnings of a plan that required someone with archive clearance she didn't have, time she didn't have, and a guard downstairs who was, she was beginning to suspect, far more capable of getting her both than a bargain rate contract had any right to produce. She found Rourke on the concourse below and told him what Rennick had said, and watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. A stillness that wasn't calm exactly, but close and careful attention, the look of a man recalculating. "Archive access below clerk level needs a conquered service credential," he said. "Military, diplomatic, or peacekeeping rank carries automatic clearance under the old wartime statutes. Nobody's repealed them because nobody thought a bargain guard would ever need to use one." Mira went very still. "You have a service credential." "I have one I haven't used in 6 years, Rourke said, "and using it means the name attached to it stops being something I can control." "Whose name is it?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer, and when he did, his voice had none of its usual flatness, only a tiredness that made him look, for the first time since she'd hired him, like a man carrying something heavy enough to bend a spine. "Commander Elias Rourke," he said. "Ferrous Line. You won't have heard of it. Most people your age haven't. It doesn't exist anymore, not the unit, and depending who you ask, not the man either." He looked at her. "I can get you into that archive tonight. But once I do, House Vondrek is going to know exactly who's been standing at your gate for 3 weeks, and so is everyone else on this station. And I need you to understand that changes things before I do it. It doesn't change them for the better necessarily. It just changes them." Mira thought of Gurn's face behind the pressure gauges, the single word he wouldn't explain. She thought of a scar that didn't come from a dockside brawl, and a man who crossed 11 meters toward a live bomb at a walk, and a boy in a market whose throat sack had gone the color of raw fear over 2 quiet sentences. "Do it," she said, "whatever it costs. I don't have 3 days to spend being careful with your secret, when I don't even have 3 days to spend saving my father's name." Something crossed Rourke's face that might have been relief, or might have been the opposite, and he didn't explain which, only nodded once and said, "Then let's go get your evidence," and turned toward the archive spire without looking back to see if she'd follow, already certain that she would. The conquered central archive on Kessarine Reach occupied 3 sublevels beneath the tribunal spire, a cold, climate-locked vault of data cores and physical filing seals that predated half the station around it, and the credential Rourke fed into the outer door's reader made the whole security lattice go quiet and green in a way Mira had never seen a low-registry contractor's clearance do. The night clerk on duty, a young human woman half asleep at her station, looked up, read the credential scroll across her terminal and went white. "Commander," she said, and stood up so fast her chair rolled back into the wall. "I didn't know the Ferrous roster still shows you as." "I know what it shows," Rourke said, not unkindly. "I need archive access to a 9-year-old survey filing, Ocean Vein, berth 9 cradle, cross-referenced against a counterfiling submitted this cycle by House Vondrek. Can you pull both?" "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." The clerk's hands shook slightly on the terminal, and Mira watched her father's fate, in a sense, be decided by a stranger's fingers moving fast across a keyboard because of a name that meant something to people who had never once mentioned it to her in 3 weeks. It took 40 minutes. The original filing came up first, Joss Calloway's boundary survey, notarized, time-stamped, the conquered notary's own biometric seal locked into the record in a way no forgery could touch. Then the counterfiling, House Vondrek's version, and Mira, reading both side by side on the terminal screen, felt the cold, clean anger she'd first felt at Tam's bedside settle into something sharper and steadier. The counterfiling wasn't a survey at all. It was her father's original document, altered, the boundary line redrawn half a kilometer inward with a different hand, the notary seal copied and pasted from an unrelated filing 3 years later, a seam visible in the metadata if you knew, as the young clerk clearly did once Rourke pointed her to it, exactly where to look. "That's forgery," the clerk said. That's a charter violation with criminal weight, not just a civil claim defect." "Print it," Rourke said. "Both documents, full metadata trail, notarized copy for the magistrate overseer's bench." He looked at Mira. "That's your case. Not a dispute anymore. A fraud filed by a house that thought no one still alive would know how to read the seam." Mira held the printed pages in both hands like they might catch fire, and felt, for the first time in 11 weeks, something that wasn't grief or fear, or the low, grinding exhaustion of holding a business together with willpower alone. It felt like ground under her feet. It didn't last past the walk back to the exchange. They came around the corner into the exchange's outer gate to find House Vondrek's blackened copper banner already hanging from the arch above their own door, and Keys Vondrek standing beneath it with a dozen armed retainers arrayed behind him, and the mottled gray-white boy from the market standing at his shoulder with his throat sack on the same fearful color as before, except this time it wasn't Rourke he was afraid of. "Commander Rourke," Keys said, and the amusement was gone from his voice entirely now, replaced with something colder and more careful. "Ferrous Line, Prevost, I confess I did not expect the ghost my father warned me about to be standing at a bankrupt girl's gate for the price of a water filter case." He held up a data slate. "It doesn't matter now. I have invoked the adjudication of force. It is my house's right under old charter law when a small house dispute turns violent, and it has turned violent, Commander, hasn't it, since your employer's steward was found broken in a corridor 2 days ago." His attendants shifted, weapons coming visible beneath their coats, no longer hidden. The right settles the claim tonight, before your archive forgeries reach the magistrate's bench. Before anyone asks who broke an old man's ribs, or who planted a charge in a coolant manifold that was never meant to work. His throat sac flared hard amber. Win, and you may keep whatever's left of this berth. Lose, and there will be nothing left to argue about in the morning. Mira felt the ground she'd just found go out from under her again, and looked at Rourke, and found him already watching Keys Vondrek's retainers with the same flat, assessing stillness he'd used on the bomb, on the market boy, on every threat since the day she'd hired him for less than the price of clean water, and understood with sudden and total clarity that everything before this moment had been the quiet part. "Fine," Rourke said. "Adjudication of force. I accept on Calloway Exchange's behalf." He didn't look away from Keys as he said it, and his voice hadn't changed at all, but something underneath it had, some final gear engaging. "But you should know what you're actually invoking, because I don't think your father explained the whole statute. The right isn't single combat. It's a defense of claimed ground against all comers, until one side yields the field or can no longer hold it. That's the old wording. That's the wording your ancestors wrote when Ythir houses used to settle border disputes by throwing their retainers at a fortified line until someone broke." He tilted his head slightly toward the gate behind him, toward the exchange's small, battered, undefended warehouse door. "You brought 12. I'm going to need you to bring all 12 keys. Because I'm not leaving this gate until they're finished, and I promise you, they will finish a great deal sooner than you think." The silence that followed had a texture to it, the whole concourse gone still, dockworkers and merchants drawing back into doorways with the particular speed of people who had just realized they were about to witness something they'd tell their grandchildren about. "Half an hour," Keys said, and his voice wasn't quite steady anymore. "The right opens at the top of the next shift bell. Half an hour, Commander. Make your peace with it." Mira waited until Vondrek's retinue had withdrawn down the concourse before she let herself breathe again, and found Rourke already moving, already stripping the civilian coat off and reaching for a case she'd never seen him open, stowed beneath a loose deck plate just inside the exchange gate, as if he'd known, every single day of the 3 weeks she'd known him, that a day like this one was always going to come. "You just told him to bring 12 armed retainers against one man," she said. "I told him the truth about a statute he was hoping nobody remembered." Rourke opened the case. Inside, packed with the same careful economy he brought to everything, was gear that didn't belong to a bargain-rate dockside contract. A matte black plate harness, sidearms of a make Mira didn't recognize, a short baton that hummed faintly when he lifted it clear of its cradle. 12 retainers in a charter right means 12 individuals bound by the same statute not to bring anything heavier than personal arms. No breaching charges, no station weapons, nothing that could damage the berth itself, because the right's whole purpose is defending ground, not destroying it. That's the part Keys forgot when he was busy being furious. He just traded his hired thugs and their bombs for a fair fight, on my terms, on my ground, and he doesn't know yet that's the worst trade he's ever made. "You could still lose." "I could." He met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd hired him, there was nothing flat in his voice at all. "Mira, listen to me, because I only get to say this once before the bell rings. Whatever happens in that gateway in half an hour, you do not run, and you do not go quiet, and you do not let them see you flinch, because the moment they see the girl break, it doesn't matter what happens to me. They'll say your house folded, and Rennick's bench will remember it that way no matter what the paper says. You hold this doorway with me, not with a weapon, with your name. Can you do that?" Mira Calloway thought of her father, walking a boundary line meter by meter with a conquered notary at his side, because he wanted no one ever to be able to say he'd taken what wasn't his. She thought of Tam, ribs cracked, refusing even from a hospital cot to say a word that would let her carry his pain instead of her own fight. She thought of 11 weeks of being the girl everyone pitied and no one respected, and felt something in her spine straighten that had nothing to do with fear leaving and everything to do with fear no longer being the only thing in the room. "Yes," she said. The shift bell rang 31 minutes later, and House Vondrek's 12 retainers came through the concourse in a loose fighting line, and Keys Vondrek walked behind them with his throat sack on a hard, committed amber black, and Mira Calloway stood in the doorway of her father's warehouse with her chin level and her hands steady, and did not move. What happened in the next 11 minutes would be told, in one version or another, by every dockworker and merchant who watched it from a doorway or a window ledge along the concourse, and every version disagreed on the details and agreed completely on the shape. That the bargain guard did not fight like a man defending a gate. He fought like a man who had defended gates before, many of them, against worse odds, and had simply been waiting 3 weeks for someone to make him remember how. He used the narrowness of the gateway itself as a weapon, letting Vondrek's retainers funnel 2 and 3 at a time into a space too tight for their numbers to matter, meeting each rush with an economy of motion that looked, from a distance, almost gentle, a step aside here, a redirected arm there, a strike placed with surgical precision at a joint or a nerve cluster rather than a kill point, because Rourke was not, Mira understood watching him, trying to end lives. He was trying to end a fight, as fast and as bloodlessly as the statute and the moment allowed, and the two goals turned out to be nearly identical in his hands. Retainers went down clutching shattered wrists, folded knees, throats that wouldn't draw breath for a count of 10. None of them stayed down permanently. All of them stopped. The 9th retainer nearly got past him, a heavy, fast Ythir enforcer who came in low under Rourke's guard and drove him back a full 3 steps toward the doorway, toward Mira, and for one long, terrible second, she thought the line would break and the fight would spill over her, and she did not step back. She held the frame of her father's door with both hands and did not move, exactly as she'd promised, and watched Rourke plant his heel against the deck plate, and turn the enforcer's own momentum into the thing that put him on the ground hard, the baton's hum cutting off cleanly against the base of the creature's skull, in a strike that dropped him without killing him, close enough to Mira's boots that she felt the impact through the floor. By the count of 12, 11 of Vondrek's retainers were down, disarmed, or fled back down the concourse, and the 12th, the young, mottled gray-white boy, whose throat sack had never recovered its color since the market, stood alone in the gateway with a weapon in his shaking hands and did not raise it. "Stand down," Rourke told him, not unkindly, breathing hard for the first time, "and go home." The boy dropped the weapon and ran, and the concourse, which had gone utterly silent for 11 minutes, erupted into a noise Mira had no name for, not quite cheering, not quite gasping, the sound a crowd makes when it has just watched the story it thought it knew turn inside out in front of it. Keys Vondrek stood alone at the mouth of the concourse, his retinue scattered or fallen, his throat sack on the pale, sick white of a creature watching its whole calculation collapse in real time, and it was into that silence that an old, rasping voice cut clean across the crowd. "Ferrous," Gurn said, hobbling forward from his repair stall with his cane striking the deck in sharp, deliberate strokes, his throat sack flaring a color Mira had never seen him use before, something between reverence and grief. "I knew it. I knew that stance. I served the supply line at Prevost, human. I watched your unit hold the eastern trench for 6 days against 3 times your number so the evacuation ships could clear. I watched you carry your own commanding officer's body out of that trench yourself, because you would not leave him for the pirates to display. The Concord recorded you dead in the collapse 3 months later. Half the station's older residents lit candles for the Ferrous Line the week the news came through." He stopped a few paces from Rourke, and for a long moment the old Ythir simply looked at him, the way one looks at a ghost that has, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be flesh. You have been standing at a girl's gate for a bargain wage for 3 weeks, and none of us saw you. I wasn't asking to be seen, Rourke said quietly. No, Gurn agreed, but you are now, whether you asked for it or not. Kees Vondrek found his voice last, thin and stripped of every ounce of the confidence he'd walked in with. The archive filing, he said. The forgery accusation, it isn't proven. It's a claim. Nothing more. It's proven, Mira said, stepping forward from the doorway for the first time since the bell had rung, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake at all. I have the original survey, the notary seal, and the metadata trail showing exactly where your counterfiling was altered and when. I was going to bring it to the magistrate overseer's bench in the morning like a claimant who still believed her own case needed proving fairly. Now I think I'll bring it tonight, in front of everyone who just watched your house lose an adjudication it invoked to bury that evidence before I could. She held up the printed pages, and the concourse crowd, watching, went very quiet again, a different quiet than before. The right settled who holds the ground. The archive is going to settle whoever had the right to take it. Magistrate Overseer Sale Rennick did not wait for morning. Word of a charter right fought, and one at Calloway Exchange's gate reached the tribunal spire within minutes of the last retainer falling, and Rennick came down to the concourse herself. An unprecedented breach of tribunal protocol that told every witness present exactly how seriously she took what she just heard. That a fraud claim had been decided by combat before it could reach her bench, and that the combat had gone the opposite way of what the fraud's architects had planned. She read the archive documents in the open concourse, under the docking arm's cold light, with the whole crowd still gathered and silent, her throat sac cycling through colors Mira had no names for as she moved through the seam in the metadata, the copied notary seal, the redrawn boundary line. This is a charter violation of the First Order, Rennick said finally, and her voice carried the particular weight of a judge who had just watched her own institution nearly be used as a weapon against the party in the right. House Vondrek's petition is not merely denied. It is void retroactively, along with any standing the House holds to bring further claim against Berth 9 Cradle or its holder of record. She looked at Keys, whose throat sac had gone entirely, blankly white. The Concord Charter has provisions for houses that forge Concord seals, young Vondrek. You will have some time to become familiar with them. She turned to Mira last, and something in the old magistrate's bearing had shifted, some final calculation resolved. Miss Calloway, your father's survey stands verified, unaltered, exactly as he filed it 9 years ago. The berth is yours, held in your name, with no abandonment clause remaining to threaten it, since your father's status will now be reviewed as a man whose enemies had reason to want him found dead before he could contest a forged claim, rather than a man the conquered record can simply close and forget. Mira had not let herself think, in 11 weeks, about what that sentence might mean, that the Meridian Drift's disappearance on the Osh Belt Run might not have been an accident at all, might have been the first move in a plan that had never stopped moving since, and she felt the ground under her feet tilt again, this time toward a hope she had no right yet to trust. You think he's alive, she said. I think, Rennick said carefully, that a house willing to forge conquered seals and hire men to break an old steward's ribs is a house that may also have been willing to make a freighter disappear on a supply run through empty space it happened to know the schedule of. I think that is now a matter for a formal Concord inquiry, which I am ordering tonight, and which your Commander Rourke is, I understand, uniquely qualified to assist. Her throat sac settled into a steady, deliberate amber that Mira would later learn was the color Ythir used for something close to respect. The Concord Charter exists to protect claims held honestly against those who would take them by fraud or force. Tonight, on my own station, under my own bench, it very nearly failed to do that, because a fraud was better funded and better connected than the girl it targeted. It did not fail in the end, because that girl refused to be alone in the fight, and because the man she could barely afford turned out to be worth more than every retainer House Vondrek could buy. She looked out at the crowd still gathered along the concourse, dock workers and merchants and clerks who would carry this night's story to every corner of Kessarine Reach by the coming shift change. Let the record show the tribunal takes note of that, formally, in writing, in the charter's own hand, so that the next house tempted to prey on a claimant with no family left to stand behind her remembers what happened here. Torvin Vondrek arrived on the concourse before the crowd had finished dispersing, coming up from the long-haul berths in a quilted travel coat that still smelled of a private charter's recycled air, and the dockworkers who saw him pass gave him the same wide berth they gave any weather system large enough to flatten a season's cargo schedule. He was Keyes's father in the way a glacier is a snowflake's father, the same substance, compressed by decades into something that no longer moved quickly and no longer needed to. His chorus lines, where they showed above his collar, had gone a black so deep it looked less like color than absence, and his throat sack did not flare or flicker at all while he crossed the concourse, which every Ythir present understood to be the most dangerous register. There was not anger held back, but anger that no longer required display to function. He did not look at his son first. He looked at Rourke for 3 full seconds with the particular attention of a man confirming a fact he had hoped for years to be wrong about, and then he said, in standard, flat and precise, "Ferrous," the same word Gurn had used, except where the old dockmaster's voice had carried reverence. Torvin Vondrek's carried something closer to an old debt finally called due. "You've had that word ready a long time," Rourke said. "I have had it ready since the day the Conquered released its casualty list from Prevost and your name was on it," Torvin said. "I confess I did not enjoy discovering it was wrong." He turned, finally, to his son, and the look he gave Keyes was not fury. Mira had expected fury, had braced for it on the boy's behalf despite everything he'd cost her, but something colder, an assessment already completed. "You invoked a right of force against a Ferrous officer without confirming who stood at the gate. That is not misfortune, Keyes. That is a failure of information, and a failure of information is the only kind of failure this family cannot recover from twice in 1 generation. Father, be silent." Torvin didn't raise his voice to say it. He didn't need to. Keyes's mouth closed and his throat sack, already the sick pale white of the right's aftermath, went a shade paler still. "Go to the transport. We will discuss the rest of this privately." Keyes went. He did not look back at Mira, or at the burned banner, or at the archive pages still folded in her hands, and something in the set of his shoulders as he walked away told her that whatever was waiting for him aboard that transport was not comfort. Torvin watched his son go, and then turned his black, absent gaze on Mira herself for the first time, and she made herself hold it, remembering what Rourke had told her in the doorway before the bell rang, not with a weapon, with her name. Because the gate was quiet now, but the fight, she understood with sudden clarity, had not actually ended. It had only changed shape. "Miss Calloway," Torvin inclined his head a fraction, the barest courtesy the Ythir extended to an equal, not a defeated petitioner's target. "You should know that my son is young enough to still believe a setback is the same thing as a defeat. I am old enough to know the difference. This is a setback." His throat sack shifted once toward a color Mira had no name for and did not like. "I will not insult you by pretending it is anything less than what your Commander Rourke made it. But a right lost tonight is not a war lost. It is only the first battlefield your family and mine have ever met on honestly, and honest battlefields, in my experience, are rarely the ones that decide anything. Magistrate Overseer Rennick has already ordered a Conquered inquiry," Rourke said, stepping half a pace forward, not quite between Torvin and Mira but close enough to matter. "Fraud, forged charter seals, and assault on a steward. That's not a battlefield anymore. That's a docket." "Dockets take months," Torvin said. "Ferrous Line took 6 days to fall. once the wrong people learned exactly where its supply lines ran. He said it without inflection. A simple statement of fact offered the way another man might mention weather on a distant world, and Mira watched something go very still in Rourke's face, a stillness that was not the calm, assessing kind she'd learned to recognize over 3 weeks. This was older, and it did not belong to the man who'd stood at her gate. It belonged to the trench. "You're going to want to be careful what you just said," Rourke said quietly. "I have said nothing," Torvin said. "I have observed only that 6 days is not a long time for those who know how to use it." He inclined his head to Mira once more, the same fractional courtesy, and turned to follow his son, his black travel coat swallowed a moment later by the crowd still murmuring over the fight, and it was only once he was gone that Mira realized she had been holding her breath the entire exchange. "He just threatened us in front of a magistrate overseer's own tribunal clerk," she said. "No," Rourke said. "He just told us the threat already happened, 6 years ago, to people I loved, and he wanted me to know it before he decided whether to make it happen again." He was watching the space where Torvin's coat had vanished into the crowd with an expression Mira had never seen on him, something that lived somewhere between grief and a colder, more patient thing. "I need you to trust me on something, Mira, and I need you to do it without asking me to explain all of it tonight, because I don't have all of it yet myself. Prevost didn't fall because we were outnumbered. Units get outnumbered every day and hold anyway. Prevost fell because somebody sold the raiders our supply timetable down to the hour, and the Conquered never found who, because the Conquered stopped looking the week they filed us all as dead." He looked at her. "I think I just met him." Vel Aldren found them an hour later, in the thinning dark of third shift, when the concourse crowd had finally drained away into doorways and gossip, and the burned banner's ashes had gone cold in the yard. She was small and gray-haired and moved like someone who had spent a long time making herself easy to overlook, and she stood at the edge of the exchange's gate for a full minute before Mira noticed her at all. "You won't know the name," the woman said when Mira finally turned. "Nobody's used it in 12 years. I stopped using it myself most days." She swallowed. "Vel Aldren. My family held the ore concession on the second ring before House Vondrek decided the concession belonged to them instead." Mira went still, remembering Kessarine's warning in the gap between the cargo stacks. 12 years ago it was the Aldren concern, and found, for the first time since that warning, a face to put to the name. "Kessarine told me about your family. She wouldn't say more than that she'd learned better than to get involved. She learned by watching what happened to us." Vel's hands were laced together tight enough to whiten at the knuckles. "It started the way yours did. A small accident nobody could trace. A dispute over a boundary that had never been disputed before. My father fought it the honest way, the way your father would have. Papers and hearings and patience. And by the time he understood it wasn't going to be settled on paper, it was already too late to settle it any other way." She looked past Mira, toward Rourke, and something in her face when she looked at him was almost hungry, the specific hunger of someone who has waited 12 years to see anyone stand up the way she'd once hoped her own family would. "We didn't have a Ferrous Line at our gate. We had a bargain guard who ran the first night things turned ugly, because nobody had paid him enough to stay. And I have spent 12 years wondering whether it would have gone differently if even one person outside my family had refused to be afraid of House Vondrek in front of witnesses." "What happened to your family?" Mira asked, already half certain she didn't want the answer. "Scattered. My father took a settlement in the end, because a settlement at least meant we ate that season, and settlements come with clauses that make you promise never to speak of the terms again. I've broken that clause tonight for the first time in 12 years because I watched what happened at your gate this evening, and I decided that a clause written to protect a fraud doesn't deserve to still be binding on the people it was used against." She reached into her coat and produced a data chit, old, its casing scratched from years of being carried and never used. "This is what I could keep. Correspondence. A partial survey record before it was corrected." It won't be enough on its own. I know that. I've had 12 years to know that, but Magistrate Overseer Rennick is already looking at Vondrek's methods tonight in a way no magistrate ever looked at them while my father was still fighting. Put mine next to yours. Maybe two frauds 12 years apart from the same house finally add up to a pattern. A tribunal can't wave away as isolated bad luck. Mira took the chit with hands that weren't quite steady. Why now? Why not the inquiry Rennick's already opening? You could have waited, let the conquered find it on its own. Because I watched a bargain guard cross a courtyard at a walk toward 12 armed men tonight, and I understood something I hadn't let myself believe in 12 years, Vel said, and for the first time her voice caught. That it was possible to still be standing at the end of it. I wanted to be one of the people who helped make sure of that, instead of one more person who waited safely in a doorway and told the story afterward. She looked at Rourke once more. Whatever you are, Commander, whatever name you carry now, thank you for making it possible for someone like me to stop being afraid long enough to walk over here. She was gone into the dark concourse before Mira could find anything adequate to say back, and Rourke, watching her go, said only, "Get that to Rennick's clerk before the shift changes. 2 houses, 12 years apart, same fraud pattern, that's not evidence shopping anymore. That's a conspiracy with a paper trail." His eyes hadn't left the direction Vel Aldrin had gone. "And it's one more reason Torvin Vondrek can't afford to let this station keep talking tonight." Gurn found them 20 minutes after that, hobbling up the concourse faster than Mira had ever seen the old dockmaster move, his cane striking the deck in short, hard raps instead of its usual deliberate stroll. "A tender," he said without preamble, before he'd even fully closed the distance. "Berthed at the service ring 20 minutes ago. Manifest says agricultural parts. Cleared through a broker registry I have seen exactly once before in 30 years on this station." His throat sack had gone a mottled, urgent gray. "The last time I saw that registry code, human, it was on a supply tender that docked at a station called Ferrous Reach 4 days before House Vondrek's rivals there stopped being rivals. I did not think of it again until tonight, when I watched Torvin Vondrek walk past my stall wearing a face that did not belong to a man who had just lost." Rourke's own expression didn't change, but something behind it did, the same old stillness Mira had seen settle over him at the mention of Prevost. Broker registry, not a house flag. Off the books entirely. Whoever runs that tender does not answer to any charter authority docked on the station, which means they are not bound by any right, any petition, any tribunal ruling Rennick hands down before the sun's next turn. Gurn's cane struck the deck once, hard, punctuating it. "I am an old man who fixes pressure gauges for a living, Commander. I do not know what is aboard that tender. I know only that I have seen its registry code once before, and I did not like what came after." "How many berths between here and the service ring?" "4, if you go the fast way through the cargo spine." "Then we don't have long." Rourke was already moving, already reaching for the case he'd stowed under the deck plate, the one that had held the plate harness and the humming baton, mostly empty now, its contents spent in the right but not entirely. "Mira, I need you to listen to me the way you listened at the gate tonight, because this is not going to look anything like that fight. That fight had rules. A right has a statute behind it, arms limits, a floor everyone agreed to stand on before it started. Whatever's coming off that tender agreed to nothing." He looked at her, and there was none of the calm reassurance he'd offered before the right, only a flat, urgent honesty that scared her more than Torvin's black eyes had. "I need the exchange locked down, every hatch but the one I tell you to leave open. I need Tam moved somewhere that isn't a cot in the open yard where anyone can see him from the concourse. And I need you to trust that when I tell you to go quiet and stay low, it isn't a suggestion this time." "You said the fight tonight wasn't over," Mira said. "You didn't say it was going to get worse before it got better." "It's going to get worse before it gets better," Rourke said. "I'm sorry I didn't say it plainer the first time." They had 11 minutes in the end, which was 1 minute more than the coolant manifold bomb had given her on the first day of all this. And Mira thought, hauling the last of the loose deck plating over the side hatch with Rourke's help, that there was a bitter kind of symmetry in that. 6 days of her life bookended by countdowns she hadn't chosen and couldn't stop, only survive. Tam went first, over Mira's objection and his own louder one. Carried by 2 dockworkers, Gurn had rousted from the repair stall to a service crawlway 2 levels down that led, eventually, to the tribunal spire's own basement. Conquered ground, technically, and conquered ground, Gurn insisted, was the one patch of this station Torvin Vondrek's off-book tender crew would hesitate to bleed on, whatever else they'd been paid to do. "You should go with him," Rourke said, dogging the last hatch bolt into place with quick, economical turns. "No," Mira said, and didn't elaborate, because she'd already had this conversation with herself in the 90 seconds it had taken Tam's stretcher to disappear down the crawlway, and the answer hadn't changed. Her father had walked a boundary line meter by meter rather than let anyone say he'd taken what wasn't his. She was not going to be the Calloway who hid in a basement, while men with real weapons decided whether her family's name survived the night. Rourke looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, tired, urgent, out of easy things to say, settled into something that looked almost like respect held very tightly in check. "Then you do exactly what I tell you when I tell you and nothing else. Can you still promise me that?" "Yes." "Then take this." He pressed something into her hand, not a weapon, not quite, a heavy cargo hook off its winch line, the kind used to drag half-ton crates across a deck, its curved steel edge honed sharp enough by years of use to open a hull seal in an emergency. "You're not going to fight anyone with this. You're going to use it to be somewhere they don't expect a person to be able to reach, and you're going to let them walk into the mistake of thinking a 17-year-old girl with a cargo hook isn't a variable worth accounting for." He killed the last of the yard's exterior lights with a flick of the junction box, dropping the loading dock into the deep, bruised dark of the station's off hours, broken only by the distant glow of the concourse 3 berths over. "They'll come through the main hatch first, because it's the only one that looks open. Let them." The tender's crew came through 11 minutes later, 5 of them, moving in a loose, practiced spread that had none of House Vondrek's retainers' stiff formality. These were people who had done this before, in the dark, for money, on stations that had never once heard their names. And Mira, flattened against the cold shadow of the cargo stack Rourke had positioned her behind, understood in her body before she understood it in words that Gurn had been right. Whatever rules had governed the last fight, none of them applied to this one. Rourke took the first 2 before they'd cleared the hatch frame, out of the dark at an angle that put the sightline of the third man's weapon 3 feet wide of where Rourke actually was, and the fight that followed had none of the almost gentle economy of the right. Mira watched him take a graze along the same shoulder Keyes' retainers had already worked over, watched him put a man down hard enough that the deck plating rang with it, watched him move like something built for exactly this and nothing gentler, and understood that the man at her gate for 3 weeks had been holding back not because he was slow, but because he had never, until tonight, needed to stop holding back. The 4th attacker broke off from the main press and came around the cargo stack Mira was using for cover, moving fast and low, clearly working a flanking line meant to come up behind Rourke while the others held his attention. And Mira had exactly the amount of warning that came from hearing a boot scrape composite decking 8 feet to her left. She did not freeze. She would think about that later, longer than she thought about almost anything else from that night. That the 11 weeks since her father's ship failed to report in had apparently taught her something about not freezing that she hadn't known she'd learned. And she came up out of the shadow of the stack with the cargo hook already swinging, not at the man's body, because Rourke's voice was still in her head telling her she wasn't there to fight anyone, but at the coil of power cable strung along the stack's base for the yard lighting rig, hauling it taut across the man's shins at ankle height in the same motion that put her flat on the deck out of his eyeline. He went down hard, his weapon skittering across the plating into the dark, and before he could find his feet again, Rourke was there, the fight's momentum swinging back his way now that the flanking line had collapsed into a body on the ground, and the man didn't get up a second time. It took under 2 minutes, start to finish, though it would take Mira considerably longer than that to stop feeling it in her hands. 4 of the tender's crew were down, disarmed, several of them broken in ways that would need a medic but would heal, and the 5th had run the moment the flanking maneuver failed, back toward the service ring at a speed that told Mira everything about how much loyalty the tender's owner commanded from people paid by the job rather than the cause. Rourke went down on one knee beside the man Mira had tripped, checking him roughly for further weapons with hands that weren't quite steady themselves now that the fight had stopped needing them to be. And when he looked up at her, breathing hard, favoring the shoulder that had taken a second wound in as many hours, there was something in his face that hadn't been there even after the rite. "You didn't hide," he said. "You didn't tell me to hide. You told me to be somewhere they didn't expect." Mira's own hands wouldn't stop shaking now that there was nothing left in front of her to aim the shaking at, and she let them, because Rourke wasn't looking at her like the shaking was a failure. "Was that wrong?" "No," he said. "That was your father's daughter." He looked down at the man on the deck, groggy, disarmed, his coat riding up enough to show a mercenary registry tattoo along his forearm that Mira didn't recognize and Rourke clearly did, because his whole face went still again, the trench stillness, the Prevost stillness. "Get Ussa. Get him now, before this one's friends realize he's the only one still breathing enough to talk." Dockmaster Ussa arrived faster than Mira would have believed possible for a man his age and build, 2 station security officers behind him, and a Warderband tribunal writ already in hand. Rennick, it turned out, had put every officer on the Reach on standing alert the moment word of the failed rite reached her chambers, on the theory, entirely correct, that a house willing to forge conquered seals might not stop at forgery once it was cornered. The mercenary, cuffed to a support stanchion in the exchange's own counting room under a security officer's watch, gave up his employer's name inside 20 minutes, not out of loyalty to anyone in the room, but out of the flat, practical calculation of a man who had done this work long enough to know which side of a charter tribunal's mercy he wanted to be standing on by morning. "The hollow concern," he said when Ussa's officer asked plainly who had hired the tender. "We don't get a house name. We get a broker code and a manifest and a list." He nodded, jaw tight, toward Rourke, still favoring the shoulder, still watching from the corner of the room with the flat attention of a man listening for one particular word. "You were on the list. Her too." A nod at Mira. An old man in a repair stall, a records clerk at the tribunal archive. 5 names one night, paid triple for the rush. "The hollow concern doesn't hire 5-name jobs on a rush without a client who's desperate," Rourke said. "Who signs the manifest?" "Nobody signs anything. That's the point of using them." The mercenary's eyes flicked to Rourke's face and something in them changed, a recognition arriving late. "You're Ferrous." "I was." "Then you already know who signs it, near enough. The concerns run the same circuit for 15 years, anywhere a house wants a rival gone quiet without a charter court asking questions after. They ran freight interdiction contracts out past the Osh Belt before that. Big ones. Whole convoy schedules, sold to whoever wanted a supply line to disappear without a war behind it. He swallowed, reading something in Rourke's face that made him keep talking faster than the question required. There was a name on the old circuit boards, a job 7, 8 years back, way out past your unit's old sector, sold a conquered relief timetable to somebody who needed a garrison quiet for 6 days. I only know because the story got told at every concerned bar from here to the Reach for years after, on account of what it turned out the client used it for. The room had gone very still. Mira watched Rourke's face do something she had never once seen it do in 3 weeks, and would not, she suspected, see it do again, Not anger, not grief exactly, but the specific, terrible stillness of a man finally being handed the one piece of information he had spent 6 years telling himself he no longer needed. "Prevost," Rourke said, "it wasn't a question." "I don't know the name of the place," the mercenary said. "I know the client paid the concern's whole yearly retainer for one timetable, and I know the client's house crest because I've seen it twice more since. Once on a supply manifest headed for a rock past the belt nobody official ever visits, and once tonight on the manifest that hired me." He looked at Mira. "Black and copper." "Vondrek." Mira felt something go cold and very clear behind her sternum, the same fury she'd felt at Tam's bedside, except larger now, large enough to include a trench on a moon she'd never see and a commanding officer whose body Rourke had carried out himself rather than leave for pirates to display. "The rock past the belt," she said. "What's there?" "A depot, off every conquered chart, kept that way on purpose. The concern uses it to hold cargo that's better off unaccounted for until a buyer's ready." The mercenary hesitated, and for the first time something that might have been genuine unease crossed his face, unrelated to the cuffs or the tribunal writ waiting for him. "Cargo, and people sometimes, if the client wants leverage instead of a body. I loaded a supply run out there myself 4 months back. 11 crew off a freighter that never made its belt schedule. I didn't ask whose freighter, I didn't want to know." He looked at Mira, and whatever else he was, whatever he'd been paid to do that night, something in his face flinched at what he saw in hers. "Meridian. That was the name stenciled on the crates I loaded. I remember it because it's a pretty word for a supply manifest." Mira did not sit down, though her legs told her, very clearly, that sitting down was an option worth considering. 11 weeks of grief compressed suddenly, violently, into a single unbearable possibility. That the search board's presumed dead had never been anything but convenient. That her father was not gone, only held. Leverage against exactly the kind of fight she had just spent 6 days winning. And she made herself breathe, once, twice. The way Rourke had taught her without ever teaching her, by example, at a gate she had refused to leave. "He's alive," she said. "I don't know that for certain," the mercenary said, with the particular honesty of a man who had already given up everything else he had to trade. "I know 11 people were alive 4 months ago on a rock the Concords never charted. That's what I've got." It was, Mira thought, more than she'd had that morning, and she found she could hold on to it, carefully, the way Rourke held everything dangerous, without letting it break her grip on the rest of the fight still in front of her. Torvin Vondrek did not wait for morning to try to leave Kessarine Reach. USA's officers caught the alert from his private charter's berth requesting an emergency, undocking clearance less than 10 minutes after the mercenary finished talking, filed under a pretext about a medical emergency aboard that nobody at the berth authority believed for a second. And Rourke was moving before USA had even finished relaying it. The service credential that had opened the archive vault 3 days ago already out and ready in his hand. They caught him at the mouth of the docking arm, Torvin Vondrek in the same quilted travel coat, Keys a pace behind him looking like a boy who had finally understood, too late, exactly what family business he'd been conscripted into defending. And for a moment nobody moved, the 4 of them and USA's 2 officers standing in the narrow arm with the black of open space, visible through the viewport at its far end. "Commander," Torvin said, and this time there was no cold courtesy left in his voice at all, only the flat calculation of a man doing arithmetic on how many of his remaining options had just closed. "I assume the tender's crew talked. Mercenaries generally do, given the correct incentive." "Prevost," Rourke said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The word did all the work by itself. "The Meridian drift. 11 crew held on an unregistered depot past the Osh Belt, because Joss Calloway made the mistake of surveying a boundary honestly 9 years ago, the same way a garrison made the mistake of holding a line 6 years ago after the hollow concern sold your timetable to the people who overran it. Torvin's throat sac had gone that same absent black, but something in it flickered now, some crack finally showing in decades of practice control. Ferrous fell to superior numbers. That is the official record. I know exactly how it fell, Rourke said. I was there. I carried the man who didn't survive it out of that trench myself, because I wasn't going to leave him for the people who'd bought their way to knowing exactly where to hit us. He hadn't moved, hadn't reached for anything, and Mira understood that he didn't need to, that whatever was happening in this narrow docking arm was being decided entirely by the flat certainty in his voice. I have a service credential the wartime statutes never repealed, a magistrate overseer's writ standing behind me as of an hour ago, and a signed statement from a hollow concern contractor naming your house crest on both a Prevost supply order and tonight's assault manifest. You are not boarding that charter. You have no authority to detain a conquered citizen on suspicion. I have exactly that authority, Ussa said, stepping forward for the first time, his mandibles set in a hard, final line. Under a magistrate overseer's writ I am currently holding, Torvin Vondrek, which is considerably more paper than your son managed to produce for an entire tribunal petition. Stand down, or I will have my officers make the point physically, and after tonight, I don't believe anyone on this concourse will weep for you if they do. Keyes, behind his father, said nothing at all, and something in his silence, no protest, no loyalty offered, told Mira more clearly than anything else that night that whatever house Vondrek had been before this week, it would not be the same house by the time the conquered inquiry finished with it. Torvin Vondrek looked at the black of open space through the viewport at the docking arm's end, calculating, Mira understood, the same way he'd calculated everything else in the concourse an hour before, and found, this time, that there was no arithmetic left that put him aboard that ship. Then I will require conquered counsel, he said, and the words came out of him like something being extracted rather than spoken, and I will require it before I answer a single question about a depot I have never heard of. You'll have counsel, Ussa said. You'll answer the questions in a conquered cell in the meantime. He nodded to his officers, and they moved, and Torvin Vondrek, patriarch of a house that had buried at least 2 small concerns and very nearly a third under the same patient, methodical fraud, went where he was told without further argument, because there was, for the first time in longer than he had likely ever admitted to himself, nothing else left to do. By the time Ussa's officers walked Torvin Vondrek to a holding cell in the tribunal spire, the concourse had been awake through 2 fights instead of 1, and it was near dawn, station time, before it finally emptied, and the exchange gate stood quiet again, the black and copper banner cut down and burned in the yard at Mira's own insistence, Tam propped up on a cot they'd carried out so he could watch, ribs bound. Grinning despite the pain, every time, someone retold the night's 2 fights to him from a slightly different angle. Rourke found Mira sitting on the loading dock steps afterward, staring out at the slow turn of cargo haulers against the dark, the printed archive pages still folded in her lap. They're going to want you back, she said without turning. Ferrous Line. Formal inquiry. Whatever's left of your old command structure, once they know you're alive. You could walk away from a bargain contract with a bankrupt girl's warehouse tomorrow and never think about Kessarine Reach again. I could, Rourke agreed, and sat down on the step beside her, slow, favoring a shoulder that had taken more of the fight than he'd let show. I'm not going to. Why not? He was quiet a moment, watching the haulers turn. Because 6 years ago I carried my commanding officer out of a collapsing trench because I couldn't stand the thought of leaving anyone behind who was counting on me to come back for them, and then the conquered declared me dead, and I let them, because it was easier than being the man who'd survived when so many hadn't. His voice didn't shake, but it had gone very quiet. I took a bargain contract on this station because I didn't want to be found. I stayed on it because somewhere in the last 3 weeks I noticed you were the first person since Prevost who needed someone to come back for her, and never once asked me to be anything other than what I actually was. He looked at her, finally. The galaxy's going to spend the next month deciding who Commander Elias Rourke is supposed to be now that he isn't dead anymore. I'd rather spend it deciding who Calloway Exchange's guard gets to be instead. That's my choice to make. I'm making it. Mira looked down at the archive pages in her lap, at her father's honest boundary line, and the notary seal no forger's hand had managed to counterfeit cleanly enough to survive daylight, and thought that somewhere out past the Ash Belt, if Rennick's inquiry found what it was now looking for, there might yet be a longer ending to this story than the one she'd expected to write alone. "Then I suppose," she said, "Calloway Exchange still can't afford to pay you what you're actually worth." "No," Rourke said, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, something that had room in it for more than watching doorways. "But I hear the owner's good for it, eventually. I've heard she's stubborn enough to make good on worse debts than that." The dawn came up gray and then gold over Kessarine Reach's docking arms, and down on the concourse, the story of the bargain guard was already being told for the 40th time that morning, growing a little in the telling the way all good stories did. And none of the tellings, Mira thought, listening to the murmur of it drift up through the open gate, came anywhere close to the plain, quiet truth of a man who had simply refused, twice now, in 2 different lives, to leave anyone standing alone at a door that mattered. 3 months later, the Concord Charter Office on Kessarine Reach amended its labor statutes to formally recognize human contractors under the same service credential protections long reserved for Concord-born citizens. A small, unglamorous line of legal text that made the news nowhere beyond the station's own boards, and that Magistrate Overseer Rennick, reading the final draft alone in her chambers, initialed with something that might, in an Ythir face, have passed for a smile. House Vondrek did not survive the inquiry that followed. Torvin stood trial before a full Concord charter bench on charges that ran from fraud and forged seals to arms trafficking in the deaths of Concord military personnel. And the bench that heard it included 2 judges who had served with Ferrous Line themselves, and did not, by all accounts, extend him any of the mercy his own house had denied a 17-year-old girl over the price of a berth. Kees Vondrek kept neither his father's seat nor his family's name in any form that mattered. The charter stripped House Vondrek of its standing on Kessarine Reach entirely, its assets placed under Concord receivership pending restitution to every concern it had ever quietly ruined. And the last Mira heard of the boy who had once called Rourke a scarecrow in the middle of a crowded concourse. He was working off a portion of that restitution himself, on a cargo crew, under a foreman who did not know or care whose son he'd been. The Concord retrieval vessel Rennick's emergency writ dispatched toward the unregistered depot past the Ash Belt did not need 3 months to find what it was looking for. It found it in 11 days. A cargo bay that had never once appeared on any Concord chart, and in it, thinner than the manifest photograph Mira had spent 11 weeks refusing to move into a memorial file. All 11 of the Meridian Drift's crew, alive, including a shipmaster who had spent 4 months teaching his fellow captives Concord contract law from memory, on the stubborn theory that whatever came for him would need the paperwork done properly when it arrived. Joss Calloway came home to Kessarine Reach 9 days after that, and the first thing he asked, walking up the docking arm on legs that hadn't held real gravity in 5 months, was not about the berth, or the tribunal, or the season's lost contracts. He asked about the quiet, scarred man standing at his daughter's shoulder wearing a guard's coat like it still fit him better than any other uniform he owned, and Mira told him the whole of it, from the coolant manifold to the docking arm, 6 days compressed into an hour on the walk back, to a warehouse door that had never once, in all that telling, stopped being hers to hold. Berth 9 cradle ran at full capacity that season for the first time in years, its banner freshly painted, Calloway in letters bright enough to be read from the docking arms, and beneath it, on quiet nights when the concourse traffic thinned, A girl who had once been laughed at for the guard she'd hired stood in the gateway of her father's warehouse beside the man the galaxy now knew by his real name, and neither of them needed to say anything at all, because the door behind them was open and held, and no longer needed defending alone.